In this episode of Roach Reflections, I want to talk about floats that mean something to me over my own roach fishing history, if you like, which goes back 50 years. I've used floats for many years, and I've got a few that date back right back to the beginning. The first float, and this isn't the actual float, but it's identical to the one, is a Drennan, I think it was a balsa float, maybe even called a caster stick. Takes 4BB and it's got a yellow top and the very end is red. And it was with one of these floats that I caught my first ever true specimen roach, if you like, which was weighed in at Best's in Wareham in March 1971. That's gone back a long time. £1 10.5, and I won the Junior Roach Cup, and it was 2 days before the end of the season, so it was leaving it pretty late. A good friend of mine was winning with £1 9, and I just pipped him, much to his disgust. And I used similar floats, balsa floats, for quite a few years. Another balsa float that means a lot to me is this one. It's an Ivan Marks 5 AAA. It's got a very fine tip. It should have a much thicker tip like that, but this one is some sort of factory freak, and when it was made they made it wrong and it's got too fine a tip, and instead of taking 5 AAA it actually takes 4.5 AAA, and I used to use that on Wareham Quay and elsewhere near there back in the early 80s, and I had many big roach on this float, including one of my best at £3, plenty of others, my best ever catch of 10 2-pounders in a day and a load more big ones the same day. A phenomenal float, and it was sensitive and yet carried a lot of weight, so it gave the presentation, and that's the key factors to a good roach float. You need to carry the weight to make sure that your presentation is good, but you need it sensitive enough to show the bites, to show what are often very shy bites. I've used stick floats a long time. This is one of the very first ones that I ever made way back in about 1973. Caught my first ever big catch of decent roach on the Froome on the towpath right in June, start of the season, on bread. Takes about 3BB. It's a very simple float, made from a float kit that you used to get in those days with a load of drilled balsa dowel and bits of cane and all the rest of it. It's just a simple bit of 3mm cane and some balsa there with a rounded tip. Simple fishing with bread flake on a 14 and ground bait. Seems a bit unlikely on a steady and slow tide in June on a boiling hot day, but 25 big roach later and a mullet as well, 1 or 2 days, that float did the trick. Around about the mid-70s, in fact 1st of January 1975, conditions were perfect. It was one of the first years we had a bank holiday on the 1st of January, and I went fishing down on the River Piddle. My mate Phil went fishing on the Froome above Wareham Bridge in the days when you could fish all the swims, and we met up in the evening. I'd had over £50 a dace, he'd had £36 a big roach. A Christchurch angler, Lionel Vine, had £51 of roach, and these were fish averaging about £1, with the odd ones quite a bit bigger. And Phil had had £36 of roach, and some other Christchurch anglers, including John Bass, Mick Maidment, Dob Chislett, they were all up there, and they'd had big catches, sort of 20, 25, £30 of roach. And Phil had noted that they were using Avon floats that took quite a lot of lead. They were using cork on Crowquill, probably homemade by one of them. Some pretty skilled anglers amongst them that could make very good floats. And he insisted we needed to get hold of some Avon floats. Well, we couldn't buy Crowquill Avons back then. We didn't have any Crowquills. Did have some balsa dowel, and I made my first proper Avon float, big Avon float. This one takes 9BB. This is the float I made. Again, it's got a sensitive pointed tip. I had very good eyesight in those days, and it did the job. And we had some big catches of big roach in the weeks after that in January and February and March, and it set me on the way with Avon floats really. I'd used Ultra, which is Billy Lane Avon floats, in sort of 1974-75, but they were ones taking about 4 or 5 BB, and this one, like I say, took 9 BB. Phil used one that he did buy from a brand called Denton floats. They weren't very good floats, and the one he had was really a chubber that took sort of 2.5 swan. Same sort of shot load as this one, but much thicker tip. Around about 1986-87, we started to get shop bought Avons from Bournemouth Fishing Lodge, where they got floats from someone called Stan Bennett in Birmingham. Ivor Britton was from Birmingham, and many of us bought the floats. This is an original Stan Bennett one, nicely made float. But one day in early 88, I think it was, I had to wait in all day for someone to change an electric meter. So I got busy, I had some Crowquills, and I made 3 Avon floats. This is one of them, I still got the other 2. And I caught huge numbers of fish on these. And after that I started to make Avons properly, learnt the skills of drilling it. This is made of 2 pieces of balsa glued together with a groove down the middle. It still worked, held together, it hasn't fallen apart yet. When we started to fish the Bristol Avon, started to make imitations of the Topper Haskins floats. So this one's made with a styrofoam body. It's an incredibly light float, weighs less than a balsa bodied one. And for casting across the Bristol Avon, it was perfect. I made quite a few of these, taking anything up to about 15 BB. You cast them underhand because of the overhanging trees, and they just follow the weight because they're so light, and that was what Topper insisted was the way to make them. More recently, I've been using this float. This one's quite old and battered. It's a blue colour because I made some floats that were pretty crude really. They're hand carved, they're not made on a drill or anything. Fairly thick bit of quill at the bottom, but it's a sensitive float again. And this one's got an Olivet. I think it's a 3.5 gram Olivet with some shot. And it's one used in one of my videos from around about last January. A very good float. And again, it's got a fairly short tip, a bit like the Stan Bennett ones. Sensitive bit of Crowquill there. Now during this year, I've started to make my waggler floats with hollow pole float tips of 3mm, 3.5mm, 2mm and so on. And I realised that they really show up in the light, and I started to make a few Avons with 3mm tips. I've made some with thicker tips as well. This is an example that I used on the Avon quite a bit this year, and also on the Stour. 4.5 gram Olivet plus some shot there, so really it's about a 5.5 gram float. Big float, nice and sensitive, bosses the water, which is what's important. Here's a much bigger example. This has got, I think that's a 4.5mm tip. Again for the Avon, I don't know what weight that takes, probably around about 7 grams. I've long been a fan of stick floats. Back in the mid-70s, once I got a checkbook, I could buy mail order floats from Marks and Marlow. This is a typical Ivan Marks float from back then. I've got quite a few of these, odd ones, different sizes, anything from around about 5 number 4 right up to 5 treble A. Don't think they quite take that much lead. This is a typical one taking about 4 BB. Probably used more for dace fishing than roach fishing on the Froome and the Piddle. Nice float. Come the early 80s, John Dean brought some floats out. And this is a typical John Dean plastic stem stick float, and it was a float like this. I also had another £3 roach on around about 1984, I think it was, 84 or 85, and still excellent floats, and they're still around. There were so many sold that they still turn up on eBay and car boot sales and so on. That's just a flavour of some of the floats that have become favourites for me for my roach fishing. They're all sensitive to shy bites, that's the first important thing. Secondly, they help present the bait well, that's important. Sometimes there's quite a shoulder on a float. They nearly always have sensitive tips to them, fairly small tips. Sometimes I see people fishing with very thick tips or big flat headed tips on roach floats, and I'm not convinced they're seeing the shyer bites. They may see the ones that plunge the float down, which is all very well, but remember, not all the bites are like that. Some of them are much shyer, and they're the ones you need to see as well. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of Roach Reflections. Please click like and subscribe. There should be some more fairly soon, and hopefully I can get out on the bank soon once the river gets back within its banks. It's currently well and truly in flood and over the fields at times. See you soon.